answer format. Then we're going to dig into the very short article that we shared with you all, that Stephen will also put up on the screen, and go through that in a dialogical way, and then open up. But I'm also going to be looking for questions while Stephen's speaking to try and help him steer the boat, because some of you might be so engaged early on that you want to start asking questions or offering interventions, and we'll be so happy for that. So I'd like to begin with a metaphor. In a sense, I think many of us would agree that our health system is wounded, and that many people in South Africa are struggling with their contact with the health system. And if we look inwards to the students and colleagues and clinicians and researchers and bench scientists and people in every public-facing field that we have in our Wits family and in all the extended platforms outside, I think we would all agree that there are many, many areas of emergency care needed. So I don't think that we have to belabor that point. But I suppose what we're really trying to do today, and what health system science as an area of knowledge and a specific degree as well at Wits is offering, is a suturing exercise, a healing exercise, if that's not too pompous. And that is bringing together areas of social knowledge, of context, of history, and of, I suppose we might call them the softer skills, analysis of society through critical thinking, together with profound scientific knowledge, economics, big data analysis, and obviously the fields and disciplines that make up clinical medicine, clinical associates, nursing, therapeutic sciences, and other allied fields. And we'd like to start with this question, Stephen, since you've been thinking about this for so many years. When students come to the University of the Witwatersrand, and this could be a case that we could speak of across the country, what do students in the undergraduate area know about the health system?
Thanks for that metaphor, which I think is apt. One of the things I think we recognize around health system science as a discipline is that it is multidisciplinary in its approach. And the advantage to that is that we're not so tied to certain ways of knowing, and we're not completely convinced that what we know is the only way of knowing. So we allow ourselves to recognize that there's huge value that comes from clinical disciplines that have established themselves in particular ways to create certain kinds of social subjects that go out and do things in the world with very high technicist skills. And yet at the same time that there are limitations to the way that we currently train clinical students in these programs, the ways in which those professions are constructed that create forms of power that are enacted in society, and that we can, by suturing together those highly technicist clinical skills alongside other ways of thinking about what they're doing in the world, allows for a better clinician to emerge. And part of our argument, and the reason why we selected this text, was to say that systems thinking should be taught as a kind of a logical skill that takes time to learn, and that all undergraduate students should have exposure to ways of thinking systematically and critically about what they do. And one way in which, or one lens through which to do this would be through the lens of health system science as this discipline that is multidisciplinary and can draw on the strengths of many different ways of knowing. So when we ask what students actually know about the health system, they know normally a number of things. They have implicit knowledge from their own experience. And that would be variable depending on what students' exposure has been to the health system. If they are students who come from wealthy families who've only ever navigated the halls of private GPs or private hospitals, their visional view or understanding of what really happens in public spaces might be quite different. But we know that that's not necessarily the case, that students normally have some exposure to the public health sector themselves as patients, or having navigated those spaces with family members. And often when we ask students what their perception is of the health system, they jump directly into kind of negative views of what the public health sector is. And part of this, I guess, is that when we are highly critical of our health systems, we tend to point out what goes wrong, and we don't seem to focus on the many, many things that go right in our health system, all the successful babies that are delivered, all the successful operations, and the many, many successes, because it's much more newsworthy to talk about the 900 babies that have died in Baragwanath most recently over the past year or so that audit was done. And it's important that we do point out those failings and fault lines. So I think that's one thing that we can always draw on, is drawing students, or at least point to, is drawing students, making students aware of their own assumptions around the health system, and why it is that there's often a negative connotation or association. The second thing is that students tend to see the health system through the lens that they're currently being directed into, or the profession that they're being molded into. So students such as BCMP students, clinical associate students, whose exposure to the health system is through the district health system in district hospitals, they're going to see a certain aspect of the health system, but they don't necessarily see all the interacting component parts. And the lens is always clinical, even if, I mean, and appropriately so, if those are the skills we're trying to teach. But it doesn't mean that they are not recognizing in their engagement that there are things that are happening around them, and that they don't necessarily understand why it is that structures of management are set up the way that they are, or that information is collected in the way that it's collected. So there's a whole bunch of aspects of within health systems as a content area that students would benefit hugely from. At the same time, we can always ask, not what do students know about the health system, but what is it that they don't know? And those that becomes kind of evident, and this was one of the points of the paper, that students aren't, or are not appropriately, what's the word? Not trained. That's not correct. They are not prepared for the actual environments in which they end up working. That we tend to prepare, or we tend to train students, particularly when it comes to things like clinical skills. We can train them very, very well, but they're not prepared for environments that might be fractured, fragmented, or require other aspects like teamwork, communication, and so on and so forth. And in South Africa, and please to stop me if I start babbling too much, but in South Africa, of course, we know that our health system is particularly fraught, and there are power dynamics, and when we talk about the wound within our health system, that is currently a festering wound that has a deep-seated historical past. And one clear thing that students don't know, which they know in other countries, is the history of the spaces in which they end up working. Yeah.
And maybe I can just stop you there before the next question, because colleagues might know this. I think many of our colleagues have read widely in the pedagogies of their own disciplines. So I'm speaking as part of a group of people. It's not that Stephen and I are the only ones that know this, but colleagues in countries to the north of us, colleagues across the Atlantic, colleagues in places like Cuba, which I had this demonstrated to me 3 weeks ago when I went to PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute, and a Wits linked doctor from Cuba actually did a whole history of the Cuban health system, the Chinese health system, the South African health system, the American health system, and the British health system. It was a tour de force lecture. I think some of you might know this gentleman. But in other parts of the world, part of clinical and health education is indeed to understand the history of that system. And what that does, if you place it inside of the curriculums and suture it together with other kinds of profound learning that people are doing, is that you introduce right from the beginning an idea that a system is created. Yes, we're born into it, or yes, we come into medical or health education or any other area of life. We come into a system, but the system is not in that sense normalized or naturalized. And therefore, you immediately have to populate the question of how did we get here with questions about context, with questions about purposefulness, about choices made. So there's a reduction of fatalism, and there is an increase in questions of agency, politics, purposefulness, all of which are the contextual fabric behind asking, how did this policy come to be? How was this financial structure created? Why was this a hospital-centric choice made, or this choice made, or this choice made? And that means that you bring into the picture not only high-level structural features such as I suppose what in some senses economists and perhaps sociologists would think of aggregated forms of structure, but you also bring in structure with a small s. You bring in agency, personal decision making, leadership, responsiveness. So you also bring in obviously questions of forms of state, forms of legitimation, forms of authority, and what creates an esprit de corps, a purposefulness, and why health would be funded at all, or how it links to citizenship. By creating something of a legacy argument, by creating an archaeology of that and seeing the layers of that and bringing that in, you don't create just a fact-heavy background, people learning facts off by heart about process and time. You're creating a language for systems analysis. So as Stephen pointed out, and we'll come back to you now, Stephen, the last thing any of us want to do is to ever begin any teaching or education encounter with the idea that students have a deficit, because as Stephen pointed out, they're all bringing so much to it, as are each of us. And nor would we ever want to argue that students, when they come into an education program, have more lack than they have capacity. But what do we do with the kind of social subject that a student is when they come into the university? In other words, let's put the spotlight on ourselves, Stephen, you and me and our colleagues. What kind of social subject is the University of the Witwatersrand creating also when it addresses students in first year as they're studying medicine, nursing, therapeutic science, clinical associates, genetics, BSc, and so on and so forth? What is it that we are part of creating? Handing over to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a complicated question because it is, there's a reason why health professions are set up in the way that they are. And there's, again, a history to these professions that have allowed for certain forms of power to be imbued in the practice that professions enact in the health system. And part of, I mean, it's almost comes down to the idealized version of what it means to be a doctor. When you ask, particularly in our degree program, we have the Bachelor of Health Science students who are trying to get into medicine. When we ask them what that looks like to them, they've got a completely almost irrational idea of what it is to be a doctor and to work in the health system. And I think it starts to settle a little bit more once they've gone through our degree program. And part of that is because there's an imaginary of what various professions do and the dynamics between those professions. And that, of course, starts with how we train students, to the point that medical students are held, this is maybe subjective, but they are upheld to be the most important students in a health science faculty, because we are turning them into doctors who are these things that represent, many other aspects. So I think drawing students' awareness to the forms of knowledge that we are training them in, and what that power actually means. I mean, it's part of a discussion around professionalism, actually cuts across what happens in our faculty. And it would be relevant for many clinical programs to unpack the nature of that knowledge, and how it's formed and why it is that they're subscribing to that knowledge to begin with. Yeah.
And of course, many of us have heard the argument, Stephen, that we can anticipate that is a luxury that we can least afford. This kind of stepping back is seen as the domain of philosophers and ethicists whose intelligence and disciplinary knowledge is often valued in our faculty, but as an assistant or in specific domains or when it's called for. And what we don't see is that our entire educational ethos in this subject creating endeavor is principled on the idea that we come from something and that we have got to understand at least the way to keep resourcing our next steps with the history of the discipline that we're on. For example, Wits is one of the only universities that has no master's or honors qualification in the history and philosophy of science or clinical science. And this is something that we are all endeavoring at the moment to move beyond, because there's an assumption often in our subject making endeavors at Wits that anatomy, physiology, chemistry, organic chemistry, various other fields of knowledge like pharmacology don't have a very complex history of themselves. And that's often where students speak about the need to colonize disciplines, and our university is committed to decolonizing disciplines with the idea, I think, primarily behind that, that the knowledge field and its archaeology is brought to the surface so that decisions can be made about what is vital, what is iterative, what is worthwhile, what is validated to carry on with, and what is performative and cultural and actually carries normative values in it which we repudiate. So, for example, the idea about a certain kind of a clinician-patient relationship, about a certain way of approaching the teaching of a field. These are some things that in a hidden curriculum, our best clinical educators are able to do almost instinctively with the way that they describe the background to the knowledge field that they are putting forward. But it is not something that we highly value at Wits. It's not something that we yet give an enormous amount of credit to. So some clinical educators that we are witness to every day are outstanding, almost instinctual structural thinkers. But because it's not something that we are teaching ourselves often in undergraduate degrees, and because it's something that our university doesn't specifically validate or reward, it is something that we are unable to hold our colleagues to. And where do we see the consequences of this? We see the consequences of this in critical writing and thinking skills. We see the inability of graduates when they go out in the world to be often interprofessional advocates for each other. We see this in the discipline-specific thinking that silos in a reductionist way, nurses, pharmacists, physicians, social workers, respiratory therapists, and so on and so forth, trying to then work together in specific environments. And it's to that this particular group of USA-based authors are turning our attention. And remember, colleagues, that it's in our session next week that Stephen is going to take you through what we've actually designed, with Stephen as a key leader in this, for our students in the health system science undergraduate degree. So we are going to come to a more South African specific space next week and a Wits specific space. But maybe, Stephen, over to you to just help us through this very short 5-page article by these two professors from a very privileged university, but is a state university, not a private university, in Baltimore in the state of Maryland, who come from a nursing background. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Catherine. And just before we look at the paper, the one aspect of the thing that you've mentioned is what happens in the hidden curriculum, or the kind of learning that happens. And one of the responses that we get when we suggest that health systems is an important subject area that cuts across all programs in the Faculty of Health Sciences is that there's not space enough in existing curricula to insert this kind of content. Like, we have so much we have to teach anyway, and we have so many things that we have to look at. And sometimes I question whether professions such as dentistry or pharmacy or whoever it is have had the retrospective space to look and to see what it is that might be cross-cutting. And this is kind of what the thrust of the initial discussion around this paper is that there are certain kinds of competencies or skills that need to be taught to all undergraduate students in a health science degree program. And one of these is systems thinking. They don't take our approach that the skills should be taught through the field of health systems science. They're saying there are other ways in which systems thinking can be developed. And what we're doing differently at Wits, and what we'll show next week, is how this emergent multidisciplinary field of health system science is actually an ideal space to do this. The one thing that I feel is kind of lacking is in the idea of hidden curriculum is that we need to create space in our in the curriculum for students to learn stuff that is not what we're teaching them. Space for them to develop their own interests, and to see how those interests, what they learn in the real world outside of the classroom, actually applies to their lives. That they are people with interests who become professionals who work in a professional work environment, but that their own interests should be supported, and they should have space to explore those interests, so that they're not completely exhausted and overwhelmed by the time they are met with adversity, that they've built up resilience. And this is why we've coupled, I guess, in our department, what we teach in health system science with medical and health humanities, which is looking at other content areas in literature, art, music, film, where that allows people to develop those interests, and to showcase those interests, and develop resilience when it comes to addressing complex challenges that they might face in the real world, in the health system. I'll share my screen so we can look at the paper collectively. So the title kind of linked well with what we were briefed to discuss around application of systems thinking in health science education. So this is educating healthcare students, strategies to teach systems thinking to prepare new healthcare graduates. And it's taken from the perspective of nursing. It's in the Journal of Professional Nursing. And again, as you've forefronted, Catherine, that this is from an American perspective. When we were deciding which paper to share, of course, we thought, let's choose something that's short. So 5 pages is quick to get through. And I did a pretty quick reading of this myself. But also, we questioned whether this would be applicable in our context, because they talk about a highly technicist work environment. And we felt that there's still aspects or points that they're raising here that would be relevant for what we're doing. They preface the discussion around systems thinking by saying that it's clear that one of the gaps in their educational experiences is that graduates, particularly nursing graduates, are not properly prepared for certain aspects of in the work environment, applying themselves to team-based learning or team-based work, and making links between experiences in the health system, how things fit together, and how things move, because they've been taught in silos, and that there are ways in which we can break down those silos in undergraduate teaching. Before they discuss some of those strategies, they first have a description of how they define systems thinking. And I think it's useful to look at these definitions, because I think the concept of systems thinking is constantly evolving, and there are many ways in which we can frame this. And of course, they're saying it comes from systems theory, which didn't necessarily have a link to health, but was very quickly then applied to health. And it's recognizing that there are many component parts within a complex system, and often those component parts operate in closed kind of loop relations to each other. And we can teach those component parts separately, but it's how we see the links between those things. And what do we do when the systems are much more fluid or complex and much more open, and there are multiple influences that move beyond the system? How do we start to deal with this big mess, while focusing on what it is we need to do and what is our main objective? So I think that was quite useful, how they took systems theory and then moved it into what does this mean then in the complexity of the health system itself? And they recognize that the need for systems thinking is particularly important at undergraduate in undergraduate teaching, because it kind of sets a basis in terms of how we develop critical thinking skills that can be applied to clinical reasoning, for example. And they then also mention that the environment that their students are most likely to work in is a high-tech environment, because our health systems are becoming more complex and technologies keep shifting and changing. And they later on talk about different kind of pedagogical approaches that take this into consideration. How do we work with knowledge that keeps shifting or moving, technologies that keep advancing? What we teach now is not going to be is going to change within 5 years. And they said, even in the publication of this paper, by 2025, they predicted that the environment that they were sending nurses into would not be the environment in which they were writing this paper. So we can question whether that is the case in South Africa. There are certainly cases where South Africa is abreast with latest technologies. But sometimes we make this analogy in health system sciences, at least in our teaching, that we can look at what international best practices and gold standards are and what would be ideal, but we have to work within the constraints of our health system. And sometimes it's better to have a Toyota Corolla driving on a dirt road than having a Ferrari driving on a dirt road. And we've got to first fix up the road and have a car that's appropriate for the road. This is a really bad metaphor, but we started with a metaphor before we can get to those standards. So what they do following this is move into a discussion around certain strategies, and they make reference particularly to team steps. And to be honest, I didn't know what this was until I read this paper. It's basically an approach that was developed by the American Nursing Association. I think the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and a bunch of other people. And it's looking at the nature of team, particularly clinical teamwork, and the relationships between different role players, from the administrative to the technical to the clinical within a team, how they should communicate or could communicate most effectively around the needs of a patient. And particularly in cases of, for example, they give examples of when there are emergencies, how to make sure that they use this typical systems language of efficiencies and effectiveness, which I think is appropriate, even though we can be critical of that language, and how to maximize teamwork. But they take one step back and they say the only way that this can really be real for students is if they learn in an environment that is inherently a mixed team environment, that students learn in an interprofessional education or peer-to-peer practice or interprofessional practice. So we should be creating spaces in our curriculum for students to be learning together. And I think we've been making the same argument in health system science, that the content areas that relate to health systems would cut across most clinical programs, whether it's nursing, BCMP students or medical students, that they're all going to be working in the same environment. And they need to recognize what that environment looks like and how they fit into that environment and how they need to relate to each other. What the authors here say is that one of the key constraints is that it's difficult to actually create opportunities for interprofessional education, which is a different topic completely. But because it's of the logistics of putting students together, and also that it needs to be modeled by the faculty themselves, by showing how they would work in this environment. And sometimes just getting people's calendars to align is really difficult. What I think is definitely possible is to have kind of elective or standardized modular courses. And this is perhaps an opportunity with our MBBCH and BHSC review, where students can elect to take a class from different degree programs, where they will be sitting in a class with nurses, with clinical associates, with health system science students, with medical students, addressing similar concerns that require a team-based approach to fix it, and looking at what students, what their roles would be, what they would contribute, and the point of view in which they would be seeing this problem to solve complex health systems problems. And also to see to develop a sense of the need to work with other people, the kind of implicit interrelationships between different disciplines, but also the importance of how the system needs to be a caring system for the people who work. I think quite often the healthcare workers are almost seen as those moving parts within the health system, and they're not seen as people with lives, with problems, and that a similar argument could be made about administrators, that they have certain kinds of tasks and jobs, but in actual fact, that this is a humanistic space in where that is messy in the humanness of it all, and that is also appropriate within, of course, professional boundaries. So topics like professionalism, which is what they raise here, could be discussed. And here, again, are opportunities for content from medical and health humanities to discuss the nature of professions, how they're constructed, how they relate to each other, where those power dynamics come to play, and how to address other more implicit power dynamics that might be linked to our context around race and gender. They also talk about the importance of 21st century skills, and that within frameworks that they provide here, for example, this team steps framework, where they say there are clear 21st competencies that are relevant for non-clinical and clinical degree programs, such as communication, teamwork, conflict resolution, and management, and they mentioned a few like that. What they draw our attention to is that professions in health science education tend to be reductionist and tend to be focusing very in a very insular way on their forms of knowledge production and the kind of social subject, is how we started our discussion, that they're trying to produce to enact certain kinds of professional roles in a system that's supposed to support them. The challenge with this kind of reductionist framing is that we don't see how we relate to other people. And we cannot operate in silos. We have to create opportunities in undergraduate education for people to cross-pollinate, to talk to each other, and actually to share similar human experiences of becoming through the student experience, through the trials of learning and being in higher education, those are kinds of bonds that could be really productive when it comes to working in the professional environment. So they raise this concern about that traditionally the forms of knowledge tend to be reductionist, and then they present different potential approaches that could be used, pedagogical and andragogical approaches. They explain what they mean by the difference between those two things. I don't really know why it's so important. The first one that they talk about is paragogy. I think this is something that is definitely relevant to this process of review that we're talking about. It's a recognition that the generation that we're teaching is not the generation that we were when we were students, and that there are shifts and changes to the way that students engage with knowledge, and that we have knowledge ready available at our fingertips. And that what we really should be teaching students is how to access knowledge and information, and how to be critical of what they're accessing, and how best to sift through huge amounts of information and make sense of it. And they make, I think, I can't remember if it's here, but they make a practical link to things like health informatics. How do we create systems that can be easily accessible, where information is captured very quickly, that helps us to make informed decisions around patient care or patient management? And those kinds of practices around health informatics, that kind of subject matter can be taught again between different degree programs, how those systems are set up, how the information is captured, how it's interpreted, and who uses it, and who's encouraged to make changes through that information. They also talk about heutagogy. This is, I mean, maybe other people on the call who are educationists and experts in this field wouldn't have known these terms. I don't really know why they raise this particularly, but here they link this more closely to andragogical practice. And they say that it's how do we get, I guess it's around the idea of lifelong learning, that we also need to create social subjects that have a passion for continuous learning because the environment is changing so much. They have to be has to be self-determined, and it has to be self-motivated. And so I think we do that in some ways. We create, certainly as we'll show next week, and how we've set up health system sciences, we've created certain kinds of learning interactions that are intended to be self-motivated, where students explore things that are of their personal interest. And they have to do it in obviously within a timetable, tabling and all the rest, but no one's telling them to do it, and there's no consequences if they don't do it. But we obviously trying to get them to be motivated to learn for their own good, for their own development of their own professional identities, and so on and so forth. And so I think they're saying that we have to have different approaches if we want to work across teams, across disciplines, at an undergraduate level. If we want to show the complexity of a health system and get people to think in a systems way, that we have to approach this from different pedagogical or andragogical perspectives, and that we have to create different kinds of learning environments that foster this way of thinking, that can then be modeled and then enacted later on, and to prepare students, undergraduates particularly in this instance, they're saying, would then be better prepared for the complexity of work and the work environment. That was my reading of this text. I think I can stop there. And perhaps
wonderful questions that are coming in from our colleagues, Stephen. But don't take your sound off. You can have a look in the chat now that you can breathe, having worked us through the article. And we've got colleagues coming in from like Nabila Suchi, and a few minutes before we had Anastasia offering a couple of points. And we also have colleagues that are referring us to the critical thinking architecture needed, like Chekhov and others. I wonder if you'd like to look through a few, but one of them I thought we could go to straight away, if colleagues wouldn't mind, and that was Anastasia's comment about the way in which you've got CPDs from senior years into the postgraduate space, and this kind of use of seeds, environments, blossoms, and blooming. Anastasia, I don't know if you're able to open mic, but maybe you could develop that point a little bit, because I think it builds on a lot of this article.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks, Stephen. I think can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
I think it's a very interesting discussion, and coming from a very vulnerable space that for most of us, a generation of professionals, we weren't also exposed, in a sense, very deliberately to systems thinking. It was a very biomedical approach for a long time. And so we also are in a very vulnerable space, as it was with, blended learning, where we've had to learn and teach as we go. And so I like that concept that students actually would come not as blank pages, but having something to offer. So my thoughts, as as yourself and Catherine went along with this discussion, is there is a space to introduce this, as this becomes very relevant now. And this whole concept of humanities within the medical space is very relevant for very many reasons. So students who want to go into health, health professions would possibly from grade 10 or grade 11, be channeled towards certain courses, certain subject choices, career counseling around certain things. And I don't know, well, not that I don't know, I do know, but I'm wondering if there isn't a gap to harness right from career counseling developers, that even in the Wits brochure, for instance, that it would be necessary that, as an added point to coming through, that students could possibly have a form of a step down, not watered down, but an introduction to systems thinking that they could do and add to their portfolio as they, apply coming through that one. And then so you have the students who are already in the system. And Nabila rightly mentioned that within the BCMP, it's part of their curriculum to do, medical humanities. Is it not possible then that, from the pre-GEMP years, your MBBCH 1s and 2s, that part of the curriculum will then be, an elective or an introduction, something worked through the curriculum. So literally looking at that from an undergraduate level. But even going further, we already have, so that's the whole, the seed for me then is the graduate or the Wits health professional who has just graduated day zero. There are lots of gaps for learning, and not just for humanities, even in biomedical curriculum, that students aren't consultants on day one, but they then are seeds that when planted within the right environment, possibly in a hospital where there are CPDs that are linked to things like this and more, begin to grow themselves within a lifelong learning curve. So I was just proposing in the chat that we look at the whole curve, the whole learning curve from health system science students right from, high school up onto the postgraduate space, what little inputs that could go in, and big inputs, and, significant inputs that gets people to begin to think from a systems perspective. Thanks, Catherine, for drawing me in.
That's great. Thank you so much. Nabila, would you like to unmic? And Stephen, also feel free to come in because you've had a chance to look at the questions. Maybe Nabila, you could also come in. I know you're building on what Anastasia said, but you're also looking beyond clinical medicine. Would you like to make your points? And then I'll come back to something one of the others said.
Thanks, Catherine. Which point is this?
The one building on the clinical, beyond the clinical medicine disciplines. I think it's up physiotherapy, pharmacy, you brought up a few. Maybe talk into that a bit. I'm not saying you're contradicting Anastasia, you're not, you're just building on it, but I would like to voice that out as well. If you, it would be great.
So I think it was one of the things that I've been thinking about, and one of the things, within our fields and how we're teaching and how we're trying to teach as well, in that we talk about a multidisciplinary team. And in my head, as listening to Stephen and listening to yourself talking as well, thinking around, we talk about the multidisciplinary team, and we talk about the ideal team and working together and empowering each other and valuing each other's professions. But at the same time, there's also a need to understand how each profession fits into the healthcare system and what their challenges are, so that we can empower each profession within the system, but collectively also. Because I'm looking beyond the patient care aspect. I'm looking at the system, we complain about not having wheelchairs and not having crutches, but as a clinical person, we don't always know that, and we don't know how to empower that or what the resource constraints are. And I do think there's value in, from an undergraduate level, just bringing professionals in that can speak to that from a public health, but also community-centered approach.
I don't think colleagues will disagree with you about that, but maybe, Stephen, we should tackle some of the harder challenges as well. I mean, Nabila, in a sense, what you and Anastasia are saying are huge. They're huge challenges to the way that many of us are doing things now. I don't want to make it an us and them thing, because obviously there are many people in this group who are already doing a lot of this in their work, and there's some of us that haven't been able to yet, or there are huge impediments to it. But one of the things that these authors in this article put together, and they draw on other literature, is that there are better answers and then better still answers. Nobody wants, obviously, for students to end up having moved through a curriculum and coming up with the wrong answers. Let's just use a clinical example for a minute, Nabila, which maybe you had a chance to read. Nobody wants somebody to end up with the wrong therapeutic or the wrong drug delivery or coming up with the wrong judgment about the vulnerability of an individual sufferer's different co-created morbidities and so on and so forth. So what the author suggests is that certain kinds of systems thinking approaches result in students coming up with a good answer or an answer that's somewhat appropriate, but then through these systems thinking methodologies, they improve and improve and improve on the answer that they offer to a conundrum, to the journey that a person who has come to them for various kinds of treatments, for cures, for emergency care, for family-directed support, for various therapeutics. And so the idea is not that students get a right or wrong answer for something. The idea is that there's always more to know, and that as long as you get going towards the correct direction, you can have layer upon layer upon layer, and that comes through trust, through being able to constantly self-reflect and to draw on the knowledge of other people in a team. And the conditions for that is not only intellectual sophistication or individual confidence on scientific correct facts, but it's on interprofessional learning. I'm sure that this part of the article is the most challenging, and therefore it's called heutagogy. So in this section of the article that Stephen covered quite quickly, they're drawing on evidence that comes out of pedagogical experiments and out of health science faculties, mainly their background is nursing, proving that better clinical diagnosis and treatment emerges from systems thinking based teaching and assessment of students. I'm very curious to see what colleagues think about that, because that's a very different model than, for example, a particular kind of multiple choice question format.
Yeah, I see Richard has his hand up. Do you want to add to that, Richard? Do you have a question?
I had a not to add, well perhaps related, but I had a comment and a question, and if I might come at this from a clinician perspective, the article that you shared with us, I found very interesting, and I'm familiar with the team steps approach or set of tools that they provide through the HRQ that is referred to in the article, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and they provide a number of tools or frameworks within which we can consider systems thinking and the interdependence of the component parts, and as you well know, within the context of health system sciences, we've always sort of tried to push this interdependence. But as a clinician and undergraduates and teaching undergraduate students within that context, we often present tools and frameworks as aid memoirs, as ways in which students can learn appropriately, and they tend to be entirely around, well, they're certainly patient-centered, often from a very biomedical perspective, which is challenging. But it still centers on, has the stake in the ground as being the patient, as opposed to the system. So take, for example, the steps of taking a history and then the steps of doing an examination. It gets quite detailed into inspection, palpation, percussion, auscultation. For inspection, for examination, you have to look at the previous medical history, the allergies, habits, etc., in terms of taking a history. But for example, one of the frameworks that the team steps talks about is called STEP. And that's the S is the patient status. So everything I've said fits in there. But the TEP is the team members. So that's everything about the fatigue, the energy, the drive, the resources of the team members. the E is the environment in which they're working, and the P is the progress towards the goal. And I think that's a very good example of a framework within which potentially we should tell that to the first years. And then after that, we talk about the P, I mean, the S of the steps, which was all the stuff about the patient. And because I think we kind of, with our frameworks and our tools and our aid memoirs, we kind of drown out systems thinking sometimes, because unless we use systems thinking tools and frameworks to begin with. But so I'm finding this very interesting, but I do want to ask my question, and I'm taking up time, but forgive me, that as an anthropologist and as a certainly one of our most eminent medical historians in the country, the two of you can reflect for me as a simple clinician, how, if we bring in aspects of the history of medicine for our, the history of dentistry for our dental students, for those on the call from the School of Oral Health Sciences, for example, how does that, if we bring that in the first year, Catherine, just articulate for us in a sentence or two, how, and I mean succinctly, if I could put you on the spot, how does it then, what's the word? How does it make them better dentists, or how does it make enhance the systems thinking of that undergraduate medical dentistry student? Help
Okay,
me
so
on that simple level, as me being me and needing it spelt out.
I'm also chuckling with you. I see David and Danielle have their hands up, so I really will try and do this in 3 sentences.
Sorry, I'm being too long.
Wits Dental School, its establishment in the first place was an unbelievable struggle with huge fights to Pretoria and back. And the people who made the arguments for the formation of it, including global luminaries like Mervyn Shear, they created a curriculum in which they argued that this was an area of a capacity in clinical work that was a part of human dignity and human rights, and that it would allow for job sharing across a wide array of different disciplines, and would empower South Africans, would allow them to live longer, would create a kind of link with the health system that would be at a level that was slightly different from a chemist, a pharmacist, a traditional healer, a nurse, or a doctor, and that it would raise the entire developmental trajectory of South Africa. They went so far as to say that a society without skilled dentists was a society that didn't value people, because our mouths and our teeth and our ability to eat and our ability to speak is a core area of human life, and that South Africa had the capacity to offer the service to people. They struggled so hard to form it. They created the most beautiful building in the end to house dentistry. People came from all over the subcontinent to learn dentistry. I myself had teeth pulled in that beautiful Braamfontein building, filled with art, filled with light, filled with sculptures, filled with music even. And when Wits University decided that they were going to move the health science faculty somewhere else, and they never created similar. Can you still hear me, everyone? Oh dear.
Yes, did we lose everybody?
Did I lose everyone?
I can hear you. You're back.
No, we can hear
We're
you.
all here, Catherine.
Maybe I can also add to what Catherine was saying, just from my perspective, is that if we want to recognize the patterns that are constantly reproduced in our health system, often patterns that are not helpful, that are sometimes harmful, we have to understand why those patterns formed in the first place. And so taking an historical lens is really valuable, because often what we recognize is that what we think, because we teach historiographies of health and health systems, so ways in which certain aspects of health systems are written about. We recognize that that those patterns, what we think we know about the past, we realize that we don't know as much as we do, as we think we might, and that there's sometimes that those patterns can really be traced really quite far back. I can relate this even to work that I'm busy with that's linked to the Adler Museum, looking at how materials are collected in a museum, how they are labeled and named, and how those practices, which essentially are 200 years old or thereabouts, are reproduced to this day. And no one asks, but hold on, wait, why did you use those forms of categorization in the first place? Because it's become, through its repetition, it's become knowledge that forms the practice of curatorship, for example. And only when we ask that, we realize, oh, there's some fundamental things that are wrong with how that was done in 200 years ago. Maybe it was appropriate then, but now it's not. And we can see those sorts of patterns also in structures within the health system. And the way to get students to see those is partly, I mean, I'm not saying it's only through teaching history, but one aspect is teaching history or teaching knowledge systems, ways of thinking. Otherwise, we end up with the kinds of responses, for example, when we raise the need to be more inclusive around African healing knowledge systems. When we raise that to our dean, for example, the response that we get would be, well, only if there's scientific proof to show that this is efficacious. And it's like, well, you're missing the point completely, right? Because you're responding from one particular way of thinking about health and healing and knowledge, because you haven't allowed yourself or allowed the space for that to be in conversation with other healing practices. I hope that wasn't off track.
I just want to add one comment to that, which is that what I think people also miss out on, in addition to everything that Stephen has said, is that creating different fields and subspecialities within clinical or scientific work is a heroic act of human imagination. It takes courage. It's not like anatomy always existed in the field that it is, or pharmacology or dentistry, and clinical associates know better than anyone else how they fought and struggled to make their field emerge out of the embers of other fires. So none of these things are self-evident, and we don't deserve to have a system like this or like that. We get the system that we build. We get the system that we struggle to push forward and show over and over again its purpose and worth. So if South Africans in their great numbers are spending a lot of their money, resources, effort, and hope in domains that we don't teach, that are health facing, then we have to ask, we have to respond to what people are needing and think about what we are giving. So when dentistry insists that it must exist, it has to argue for why it should. And if dentistry is taken away, people have to mobilize and mourn for its loss. If tomorrow nursing doesn't exist, or tomorrow all doctors are cancelled and only clinical associates exist, it's because human beings make it so. Whereas the way that we teach often is if these things are given and they just are there. And that is a lie. It is not scientific. It is not based on evidence. The evidence is the opposite. And so if you show people this, then it undergirds the need to constantly, always explain why we're doing the things that we're doing and what their value and worth is. That is what the scientific method is. And so that's what I would say to dentistry students, is the worth of learning the history, not just of dentistry globally or teeth pullers in ancient times and up to the present, but also the history of how Wits formed dentistry. And then the terrible disappointment of the move to this space and dentistry never getting that value again, to undergird dentists saying, right, what is our motivation for articulating this? And how can we advocate for this? And how can we have the physical infrastructure that meets the need that we feel we are offering in a dignified way to the public of South Africa, and so on and so forth. So that was lots and lots of sentences, more than we meant. And maybe, Stephen, we need to get two of our other colleagues to come in. I think it was David Rubin and Daniela, if I'm right. Sorry, I can't see it anymore.
Yeah, it is. Just to note that we are at 5 o'clock, but I'm happy to keep the conversation going. Daniela, would you like to ask a question, and followed by David? We'd like to hear from you.
Hi. So mine is a comment, which I think it was covered a little bit, but I think for me, the biggest thing is about building trust, public trust in this new system. I think if that's the basis, then that will make us lead to not just maybe a system thinking, but a community-orientated thinking that we then put into the biomedical approaches, these vertical programs that do then exist. But I do feel that we don't have consensus within our own institution. We don't have consensus in terms of national policy within these institutions of training to even implement it. And it's sad because we have our colleagues in places like India where they've reached national consensus in all their states, and they're further developing a system that is about, I mean, we had in our elective, we had our 10-year anniversary, a colleague from India talking about some of the electives that they're doing that were just phenomenal, beyond we thought. You're talking about us, Kath, and what we're doing in our BCMP curriculum, but India's like way ahead of us. They have, was it yoga and meditation as an elective, reconstructive surgery for transgender patients, and again, what I realized from there is that it's not the curriculum or training people and forcing them on the public and forcing the public to trust them, but it's rather the public informing the expectations on the quality and the services of this new system. And that's what was inspiring about it, because at the end of the day, we won't get the and I'm thinking because we're in family medicine, but we talk about this competent clinician, a critical thinker, a collaborator. There's all these things. I've seen the role of a family physician, and I'm just going to think of the role of family medicine in primary health care. But if our consensus is universal health coverage, that is, we've made all that. I mean, already we don't all have consensus on the fact that it's universal health coverage through primary health care is the important goal. That's already number one, the problem, right? But how are we going to get the critical thinker to bring in that degree of critical thinking and making sense of the community data, how in terms of usage of healthcare systems, trust of the healthcare system, planning appropriately to respond to the community's needs. So I sit here and I think, how many of our boards within faculty have a community representative, a user of the healthcare system? Why are we sitting in a healthcare science facility training with no one, a healthcare user, informing it? So perhaps, much like I know the HPCSA has, although it's a bit, I could say, some of the community members sitting on the HPCSA boards, for example, aren't really users of the public health system. But anyways, but I'm thinking about, can we possibly look at these spaces where we bring in the users to inform the new system we are trying to create? And whether it's then community representative groups, possibly, but I think we are so disconnected from the community, and we impose ourselves and imposing our system on the community. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And maybe, David, we could ask you please to come in. I'm so fascinated in anticipation of a person with a strong background also in design and engineering coming to this conversation. We won't be able to really discuss your points, but please put them out there and we can pick them up next week too.
Thanks very much. I know that it's late and you're past time, so I'm going to make it extremely brief. But Stephen, that paper that you presented, I actually read it just before the lecture, and it's a few things struck me which have been a concern for me for a while. One is that they reference somebody like Barry Richmond quite extensively in the beginning part of the paper. Now, I'm very familiar with his work, and he's a very strong advocate for the idea that if you want to talk about systems thinking, you have to actually do systems analysis. You have to actually do the modeling. There are no shortcuts, he believes, and certainly Jay Forrester, who invented system dynamics, believed. So, and I've sort of come to that view myself, that there aren't really shortcuts. So that's the first point, is I've noticed this article and also the textbook, the one produced in the United States. I've had some Skype discussions with some of the authors, and I've mentioned this to them as well, and I felt that very strongly, that within this systems thinking and this idea of producing systems thinkers, there was no real attempt to actually get them to do the modeling that is required. There aren't really shortcuts to it. And only when they start to see these systems behave in particular ways through their models on computer systems can they actually start to link that back to the real world and the observations they've made, and suddenly say, ah, I get it, there's a feedback loop working here, and that's what's causing me not to be able to get my patients to comply, or that's why patients are not complying, or that's why the healthcare system is the way it is, or the budget is the way it is, or whatever the case may be. So there are complex reasons for these things, and those complex reasons are embedded in the systems theory, which I think in the health system science approach as set out in the textbook, they don't really grapple with to any extent that I can see. That was the one point, and the other one, extremely briefly, they also tend in the textbook again, and I think this has become the standard for health system science, they tend to only grapple with the systems level at the very highest level. In other words, the human organizational level. They don't delve all the way down to the subcellular level, for example. And I think there's an immense value to be gained by actually linking those two, to recognize that that your glucose level that oscillates sometimes when you give insulin is a very similar process to the fact that you can't keep the number of doctors stable in the country. Those oscillations actually have the same root, the same underlying cause. But if you don't really grapple with the systems properly, it never gets elucidated. Anyway, I know that's quite a mouthful for the end of the day, so my apologies. Let me keep quiet, and and hopefully lots more discussion in the future.
Thank you. I tried to capture some of what you said in the chat, so we have it here on record. And Stephen, we'll pick up again next week, and we really hope you come back, David, to see if you can bring some of these insights to what we have been trying to do at Wits, which Stephen has been pioneering, and where we're falling down and where we're rising up. And we hope to see you all. So Stephen, can you unmic? On behalf of everyone, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you staying late with load shedding and everything. See you next week, we hope. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Inputs, David,
Thank you
as
so
well.
much.